Hello and welcome to Newspeak. That's the New Culture Forum's look at the current news agenda. As per usual, I'm very pleased to say our two senior fellows here, Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, also royal commentator of course, and Dr. Philip Kiszely, cultural historian from Leeds University. Before we actually talk about our subjects for this week, just one notice for you. As you know, you should know by now, we're doing local events all around the country. And we started off very successfully a couple of weeks ago in Southend. Now on the 28th of March, Tuesday the 28th of March, we're going to be in Manchester. So if you'd like to come along, if you're in the area and you would like to come along to that, both of these gentlemen are going to be there, then please do get in touch with us at events@newcultureforum.org.uk. That's events@newcultureforum.org.uk, and that way we can give you the details of where and when. But it is on the 28th of March. Now, we're going to start today by talking about that famous football commentator, Gary Lineker, and the kerfuffle that has arisen around him. Perhaps more importantly, we'll look at the actual policy that he was criticising, the government's policy, the newly announced one on small boats, and we're also going to be pondering the real significance and impact of the WhatsApp leaks, which has been hugely covered in the Telegraph, of course, a big scoop for them this week. I want to start with Gary Lineker. Now, I think that before we actually talk about it, I should read the actual tweet from Lineker, which he tweeted this week. He says, "There is no huge influx. We take far fewer refugees than other major European countries. This is just an immeasurably cruel policy directed at the most vulnerable people in language that is not dissimilar to that used by Germany in the 1930s. And I'm out of order?" He's asking rhetorically. Philip, is he out of order?
Of course he's out of order. Everybody knows he's out of order. Someone should talk to him about Godwin's law, shouldn't they? There's a piece in the Telegraph that's just come out, and it shows him, this multimillionaire ex-footballer, coming out of his London mansion to a chauffeur-driven car, this wonderful socialist, and talking that he's going to carry on speaking for the oppressed and the downtrodden, and then he gets into this car and then drives away. I mean, one of the key things here, I think Rafe might come to the policy detail, but one of the key things here is he works for the BBC. The BBC is a public service broadcaster, and it's supposed to be impartial. Okay, and everybody's making a fuss that it's supposed to be impartial. Now, impartiality, the plane crashed into the mountain in 2014, didn't it? With the run up to Brexit. There's no impartiality as far as the BBC is concerned. We know that. But this is just another one of those games that they're playing. So he's been taken into the office and he's been given a real talking to, apparently. They said, "Oh, you've got to be impartial," and I think that's it. I don't think it's going to go any further.
I think actually
it's the gross hypocrisy of
it. It's actually not going to go any further from what I can gather today. The latest we got is nothing's going to happen. But I mean,
well, he's too big, isn't he? That's the problem.
Is that what it is?
For the BBC, he's their most high-paid person. Look, if he was a news broadcaster, he would have been fired for this, right? We know that for a fact. But the defence that he's just a sports broadcaster doesn't really fly, because he's the most high-paid person at the BBC. He's one of the most high-profile members at the BBC. When people see him, they think of the BBC when he's speaking. But more importantly, his Twitter platform, most of his profile there was built on the back of his BBC TV appearances. Were he not a BBC TV personality, his Twitter following will be insignificantly smaller. So the BBC had built this profile for him, and he's now using that platform to go against all of the guidelines which Tim Davies, the new Director General, has issued about impartiality. And I think that's where the problem is. But unfortunately, this is not significant enough for him to be fired over. It's not big enough of an issue. But it's the gross offence to actually equate government policy that is supported by millions of decent people in this country, to equate that with Nazism is a gross offence to them, and it just reinforces this whole idea of BBC bias. But it's also offensive to those people who have been the victims of Nazism to have their experience contrasted in such a silly, lazy way, on cheapening it so much in how this is done.
Yeah, I mean, there's another thing as well, isn't there? You know, it reminds me of Putin, actually, because Putin always takes mainstream things and equates them to Nazism, doesn't he? That's his shtick. That's that's the stick he beats everything.
So now you're comparing Lineker to Putin.
Lineker to Putin now. If he's going to bring the Holocaust into it, let's bring Putin into it and let's compare Lineker to Putin.
The thing is,
why not?
The thing is I take your points, but look, you've made the point. Right? I mean, he's not a news broadcaster. Okay, look, he's not a news broadcaster. So in that sense, you could say that he shouldn't be fired or whatever. He's not going to be anyway, but he shouldn't be. But then you can't help thinking, if he had said something like, "Well done, Suella Braverman. In fact, you haven't gone far enough," he wouldn't be in for more than about 24 hours, would he?
Well, it's funny because yesterday there was a debate on Newsnight about the Gary Lineker, and they had a chap from the Telegraph, I think, or the Times, but they also had what's his name, Alistair Campbell, on there. And of course, Alistair Campbell's wasn't defending Lineker in any other way, but by saying, well, he was right in what he said. And I thought, well, what would you have said if you actually argued for the other side? Because all the arguments you're putting forward for free speech, would you be so willing to make those if you didn't actually agree with the viewpoint?
But isn't it also the case that Tim Davie is the Director General? Basically, he's been, he's emerged from this as rather weak, isn't he? I mean, essentially, this guy's just run roughshod over him, isn't it? I mean,
yeah, and I think to go on from there, I think one of the things that really comes out of this is that we shouldn't be if Tim Davie can't control his employees or the people who work at the BBC, then we really shouldn't be paying a license fee for propaganda, because whatever you say about Gary Lineker and his job at the BBC, and if you want to separate that from his Twitter account, you really can't, because he speaks through his Twitter account. He speaks about football, and politics merge into the two.
Well, yes, one of the arguments I've heard put forward by the other side is that it's very interesting that there was no complaint when Gary Lineker spoke out against Qatari human rights abuses, for example. Why didn't the government or anyone complain about those utterances? Well, it's because I think 99.9% of the population agree that Qatar is a reprehensible state for its human rights abuses, whereas this is a far more divisive issue. Countless millions of decent Britons in this country feel very strongly about this issue. And look, I'm not a football fan, but I would assume the majority of football fans feel very strongly about this issue. And it's the conceit, and it's the arrogance, and it's the condescension of this self-proclaimed superior being that he knows better, and that he can ridicule and debase issues which are fundamentally important. And I was just thinking, when you mentioned earlier on about him having his great mansion and his chauffeur, another champagne socialist, it reminded me of Malcolm Muggeridge's aunt, who lived in a great country house. And every May the 1st, Labour Day, she was sent her butler up to raise the red flag on the roof.
No, but the thing is, in a way, I think it's almost to dignify him by calling him a champagne socialist, in the sense that, to me, first of all, he doesn't seem that bright. The very first thing he says in that tweet is, there is no huge influx. Well, there is.
Of course there is.
Right?
There were 500,000 last year.
He says that. So you've got a mixture of ignorance plus this extraordinary presumption where he says, I will continue to speak out for people who don't have voices. And you say, wouldn't something stop you as an individual from actually writing something like that?
Like good taste.
Yes.
But
also just the sheer kind of self.
Well, the stupidity. Douglas Murray was playing with him on social media, was goading him, and he came back to Douglas. Douglas was saying, well, this is pretty stupid, and he came back saying, well, I don't think they had trying to be ironic, I don't think they had social media in Germany in the 1930s, and just making it worse. That really isn't funny. So in a way it's quite good, because it shows these people up for what they are. It shows them for being completely and utterly out of touch with their own audience. It's like you said before, my guess is, I'm not a football fan either, but my guess is, the vast majority of football fans watching Match of the Day every week or whatever it is, are really not going to buy into that Hampstead nonsense.
Yes, I don't know. He said he'd never had so much love shown to him over Twitter as a result of these sort of comments. I think that, again, you know, if you're living on Twitter,
Yeah.
let's face it, we're all on Twitter, aren't we? Then of course you would get huge support for those kind of comments.
Well, apparently you know, I saw online just today that the area he lives in is about 90% white.
Yeah,
He's
of course
living in
it
a great
is.
mansion. If he actually went and lived in one of these seaside towns, perhaps,
Yeah.
and saw every day
Yeah.
the situation people have to face daily, I think, you know, that's the reality call that
Especially,
a lot of
especially,
these people need to have.
especially a town with a you know with a school that's near a hotel full of asylum seekers.
Yes.
You know.
Speaking of that, it's a ridiculous and incredibly distasteful comparison. But what is this policy really? I mean, you know, Rafe, should we even believe in it?
Well, I mean, it sounds very good, actually, one has to say, and advice was taken from the Australian Foreign Minister who helped devise Australia's successful policy. What it says on paper is that if you come to this country in the future, you'll be automatically detained, you'll be refused the right to come again. Now, how do you enforce that, I'd like to know. But anyway, you'll be detained in camps and so forth, and you'll be deported, and you won't be able to use the Modern Slavery Act as a means of staying.
That's right,
Which
yeah.
is the mechanism most Albanians use. Which all sounds great, but of course, where do you deport them to, right? So you either deport them to the home country, which for Albania would work, but for most who come from elsewhere, they've thrown away their papers. You don't know where they're from, or they can't be deported so easily. Or you return them to a third country, like Rwanda. But Rwanda is so limited in its capacity; it can only take about 300 people maximum at the moment. That might be extended to a larger number. But when you're dealing with such vast quantities of people, the idea that you're going to be able to send tens or hundreds of thousands of people to Rwanda simply doesn't fly. And the third option is that you deport them to the country from which they pass through en route here. But the reality is we don't have any return agreements with France or any other European nation. So these are the holes that you see in this policy. Again, it sounds good, but the reality is, where would you deport these people to? And the EU has just said today, or a representative of them said that this is a violation of international law.
Yeah.
So if the European Court of Human Rights rules, and it's likely to rule that this breaks international law, no European country is going to enter into a return agreement with the UK.
And
it's a complete farce.
Yeah, and of course the Tories know this, and they've always known this. This is just simple playing politics, isn't it? And they can say, well, we did it. We did all of this. We tried our best. We're hard line on immigration, you know, but we were thwarted. It's not our fault.
That's exactly what's going on
Yeah.
here.
So that degree of cynicism.
Oh yes, I think so. Certainly, because they were even saying, weren't they? You know, this is going to push the boundaries. You know, it's almost preparing people for defeat. You know,
We know that it's 50% likely to fall foul of European Convention on Human Rights. It's the blob is working against us. They're trying to create this narrative that they're fighting for the plucky underdog. You know, they're fighting for Joe Bloggs or John Bull against the elite establishment, whereas the reality is they know that they've only got 18 months left in power maximum. This bill is going to get clogged up in the House of Lords for a start for months. If it gets through the House of Lords, it will then be open to legal challenges. So that the idea that this is actually ever going to see the light of day, let's forget about the merits of the bill. The idea that this is never going to see the light of day before the next election is a non-starter completely. And they know that. They're not stupid, but they want to embarrass the Labour Party, who basically will object to this, and show themselves once again to be the great champions against crime and against immigration, whereas we know every 5 years it's the same thing. Before it was in the manifesto about getting numbers of legal migrants down to the tens of thousands. That obviously failed completely, and now they're going to make this issue of illegal migration the issue. But every time that they've done this in the past, surely we know that they lie.
yeah, and it just brings it back to the really important point, I think, which is if you are, and I'm probably preaching to the converted here, because our viewers, I don't think, are going to be voting Tory. But if you're going to be voting Tory because it's a better option than Labour, you know, what's the alternative? It's going to be Labour. Then that is the stupidest thing to do. Vote anybody. For God damn it, vote Green. I don't care, but don't vote Tory. You know, it needs to change. It really does need
Although
to
I
change.
must say, I agree entirely, but listening to the Australian Foreign Minister, who helped devise this policy, who's critical of the government as well, with Nigel Farage, he said, well, actually, if Labour gets into power, it's going to be open doors, essentially.
Well, yeah,
but
You have to ask how much wider can the doors open, I suppose.
Yeah.
But
we know that, and it's a question of, well, what do we do? Do we continue with the Tories and have virtually the same thing, or do we go down to a deeper hell and then absolutely and totally realise that we have to change?
I think the only thing that can really happen that's going to actually be constructive is if a party like the Brexit Party comes along, which is majoring almost entirely on migration.
Yeah.
Basically a Brexit Party, but for migration.
That's what I've always called for. I said, UKIP got us the EU referendum. The Brexit Party got Brexit done, or tried to get Brexit done and force the government to act. And only a new immigration party will actually force anything on this issue.
Then you come back to square one, which is our system, which is just, so against any new party coming forward.
So can I just ask, can either of you see any hope of any new party in the immediate future?
Well, I think the thing is that you wouldn't have foreseen the eventual success of UKIP, for example.
No.
And on the back of that, the Brexit Party came about really quickly. Don't forget that. It was like, so basically we've got 18 months until the next election. So if something could happen, within 6 months of an election, for example. It could
would have an impact.
It could do. In answer to your question, I can't see it happening from any of the current players as they stand at the moment.
No.
So it's got to be something.
It's got to be a completely
else.
new small party. It's not going to be
Because I think
Reform or SDP.
Like the sands of time are against us.
Yeah.
I mean, there will come a point where critical mass is such that, in fact, the strength of the feeling that you mentioned will actually not be so strong.
No.
It will simply not be so strong. I feel, it's a hunch, I've got no data, that it's already less, actually.
Oh yes, absolutely.
I think it's already less.
Well, if we remember what we were talking about last week, which was the Quran and the semi-Sharia law that's happening in Wakefield now, there should be much more outrage about that on a broader scale, and there simply isn't. So that's really frightening to me.
Well, exactly. That's the point. It also it seems to me that what was quite instructive, just to go just briefly to our third point, which is about these WhatsApp leak in the Telegraph. I was sort of thinking, when you look at the people who are featured in those WhatsApp messages all about COVID and the lockdown, can you see those people seriously taking on immigration? I mean, you've had senior civil servants in them, you've had senior politicians, you've had MPs, the lot. Now, when you look at how they dealt with the lockdown and COVID, these are the people who would be administering any kind of new policy, aren't they, on immigration? It's almost, you can't imagine it, can you?
No, well, and as we said, forget the civil service, but just in terms of politics, the Tory party isn't conservative any longer, right? And so you wouldn't just have the civil service working against the government, you'd have government working against the interests of the people. There's no dynamic, there's no desire amongst anybody amongst our ruling class to actually take immigration in control.
No, and sorry, and what you see, looking at those WhatsApp or looking at the stuff that's come out about the WhatsApp messages. I mean, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't want my WhatsApp messages to reflect my, what I say in public, because they probably don't. You know what I mean? I'm not being hypocritical here, but you do get a sense of, it's not just one person. It's not just Matt Hancock. It's the whole dynamic. It's the relationship between the lot of them, and that the priority isn't actually getting stuff done and looking after the issues and trying to confront the issues. It's narcissistic, isn't it? It's how do we look? How do we look in relation to Sturgeon? How do I look? What's this going to do for my career? That and it's not just him. It's all of them.
Have you noticed? I mean, basically, the mainstream media have pretty much just gone for Isabel Oakeshott.
Yeah.
She's the journalist who basically leaked these WhatsApp messages. Do you think she was right on balance to do that?
I think she was absolutely right. I don't know what possessed Matt Hancock to think that giving over all of your most private data to somebody who is a known lockdown skeptic and has campaigned against it, it just goes to show his level of incompetence and naivety expands beyond the realm of the health department. And I'm sure he wished that he was on the telephone for those meetings rather than. But she's absolutely got a public right interest, because we're talking about the deaths of tens of thousands of people who've died, and we're going to have a higher death toll from the consequences of lockdown than we actually had from the deaths of COVID. And those people deserve answers. And when you know that, for example, that the second lockdown and others, polling was actually, public opinion was a key determining factor and influenced Boris Johnson. When you know that politics actually led the government rather than science, in so many cases we were told that it's led by science. Well, firstly, there's no single science, but secondly, you ignored the other science too. The Prime Minister, we now know, wanted to form a red team made up of Carl Hennigan and Gupta and other people, and that was poo-pooed by the health department and the scientists on the other side, who didn't want to actually ask, are there any other options, had decided this is what the situation is, and no other data can be allowed to actually contradict this theory that we have. So it's very important that we see that. And also that we see the hilarity with which people like the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, was laughing about the idea of people going into quarantine. This cavalier attitude about the whole thing. And also how focused they were on their own personal images and how they would look.
Well, that's what I was saying before. Even Gove, is part of that, is implicated in that. When this first came out at the beginning of the week, or was it the weekend? I can't remember now. But everybody was attacking her, attacking her integrity, and it was all about her. There was a ridiculous interview with Cathy Newman, who apparently is still a journalist. Who knew, eh? After the Jordan Peterson debacle, but it's like nobody's learnt anything. We've got the opportunity to look at the biggest thing that's happened in our lifetime. What you've just kind of listed, the calamitous nature of people's health, well-being, and not just very straightforward things like that. Women stuck with alcoholic domestic abuse, as I read some really heartrending stuff. All of that thing, calamitous for people. Okay, and all the mainstream media can do is say, how much are you earning? Why are you doing this? What's the contract?
Do this, don't they? Every time you have a major story of substance, the Westminster bubble and the media bubble get completely sidetracked by insignificant issues dealing with the personalities rather than the substance of the issue.
And to be fair to Isabel Oakeshott, she closed those conversations down in a really, really effective way, I thought.
But the thing is, actually, because I do not see the mainstream news now. How much coverage has this had on the mainstream news?
It's had a fair amount of coverage.
Is it like top story?
Well, it was for a few days, but it was top story in the sense that Isabel Oakeshott has betrayed Matt Hancock. That was how it was presented. What's been great for me is the Telegraph have got a whole kind of squadron of hacks on it, churning out stories day after day after day. So that has been wonderful. I think the Telegraph have been pretty good on this,
But because you have to remember, there was a lot of criticism of Isabel Oakeshott because she works for the Times News Incorporated, and she didn't give this story to them. She gave it to the Telegraph. But the Telegraph are one of the few papers who actually have the resources to pour through 2 million words, and they cut their teeth on the MP's expenses scandal. So they're, I would say, uniquely positioned. And I think it did get a significant amount of coverage, I would say.
Well,
yes, it did, but it was framed in a particular way.
It's framed in a particular way. Also, you see, what strikes you about these journalists? They are obsessed with things like salaries, and they're obsessed with integrity in journalism. But at the same time, they must be aware, surely, that they were the messengers for all of this. They were the unquestioning messengers. Every time you looked at any of those conferences, those press conferences, it was always,
it's a hugely important
why
point.
Are you not being harder? Why are you not looking down even more seriously? Why are you not doing, why? And nobody asked where this, I remember, I don't know whether YouTube are about to take us down if we start talking about this sort of thing, possibly, but, any journalist worth their salt would surely turn around and say, well, look, first things first, where did this thing come from? They would sort of say that. Nobody.
No.
And if anyone sort of talked about China and the rest of it, quite often people were basically shut down by being called racist, even, actually. You know, this sort of thing. They didn't ask about that. They didn't ask about so much. And so they must surely be aware, unless they are super unaware, that basically they are part of the problem.
Particularly when you see that the FBI are now saying that it's most likely to leak from there. And when you see now how low the death rate was in Sweden, now we can actually look back, enough time has passed, and all of those journalists and others who were saying that we were foolish to even consider the Swedish option. But for me, the greatest tragedy of all of this is the damage it's done, the further damage it's done, if further damage could be done, to trust in our institutions and in our governments. Because the people now know that they were lied to, and they were deliberately guinea pigs of nudge theory, of behavioral science, to scare them to death. And even scientists have come out and said that this was actually unethical of them to do it, and they regret doing it. But you see through these WhatsApp messages how anything that could scare the pants off the nation, as I think is actually the words that Matt Hancock said, would be enforced. You didn't have any need for school children to wear masks, for example. We now know that was done because of Scotland. And my great fear is, look, nobody expected COVID or coronavirus. This was probably a leak from a lab. But everybody is expecting a flu pandemic. We had the huge one in 1919, which killed millions of people around the world, and in 1950, that's what all of our resources were actually meant to deal with. We were knocked off we were caught off guard with this issue of COVID, which was so minor compared to the death level. But what will happen when we do get this much more deadly flu pandemic? How many people will actually obey government guidance, having been burned? It's the boy who cried wolf.
It is, yeah. But have you noticed something else as well? You know, and this always happens with these things. So we've been all of us, this channel, the people we know, we've been very vocal about lockdown, about masks. We just thought it was wrong. End of. Right. Now we're essentially proved right. How many other people are saying now, oh, well, I thought it was wrong as well. I didn't say anything, you know, I thought it was wrong. But I don't know if you've experienced, I mean, if you can think back and some of the experiences I had. So I was going from this building, I was on the tube and I wasn't wearing a mask. I think I told you about this guy that attacked me.
For being a banker or something?
Because I was dressed like this, mistook the signals. I'm giving the wrong I'm giving the wrong signals out. But I was sat on the tube without a mask, and he just laid into me and started, because you're a bank, you're this, you're that, and actually a woman just said, look, for God's sake, shut up. And then a whole argument started in the tube train. It was hilarious, but it was just this excuse to bully someone who doesn't toe the line, who you think is different to you, and it was extraordinary.
I think it was. I think that the permanent damage, the permanent changes that have happened, you know, are immense. I actually don't think we quite appreciate.
No, I don't think we'll appreciate for a while yet.
To social life, for start. There's this tangible feeling of people being much more in themselves now, not socializing anything like as much, and it's not just trusting, but also just a sort of sense of, you know, possible hostility from another group. I mean, you know, we had it with Brexit. We've now had it with this, and they were conjoined, actually, weren't they, a little bit? But you sort of think this is going to come back with every issue now. But just generally, I think it's the general way in which we live has become more threadbare. That's the way I see it. I see the background to our lives has become much more threadbare.
Do you know what I'd really like if viewers put some stuff in the comments? One, about the kinds of experiences they had at the time, and two, how they think it's changed their lives in the longer term, because that would be really interesting to read those comments, wouldn't it?
I remember, start you off, I remember when the whole thing started. Do you remember what a beautiful sort of summer it was? Do you remember it was this wonderful, from about April onwards? It was very beautiful. But you sort of sense it's a hunch, and we're not allowed to have hunches anymore. I don't know if you've noticed. But unless basically you can, you know, produce loads of data for something, hunches are not allowed. But one's hunch was that something was just not quite right about this. That no one was denying that there was a virus, but somehow the response, And I remember the thing that has really been left with me is this disappointment, I think, in the way that people reacted. Because, you suddenly saw this sort of outpouring of it was actual hatred if you didn't wear a mask.
It was. It really was.
It was actual sort of like real, who do you think you are? It was this kind of, it was like a celebration of kind of somehow vulnerability in a way. The more vulnerable you were, the kind of,
indicative of the broader culture, and totally disproportionate. Peter Hitchens said that all the time, didn't he? It's a completely disproportionate response to what's going on. It's an inappropriate response to what's going on, and you just got that feeling as though you were the enemy. And I felt that very strongly. I felt that at work. I felt that on public transport. I felt it walking through London even.
But what is the crucial difference between the way that they did this and the way that they used behavioural, science, all the rest of it, and conspiracy theory? Basically, because I think we've talked about this recently. Apparently the way in which people now possibly believe in conspiracy theories has changed. There's a greater tolerance of conspiracy theories and everything.
Well, the difference is that this was officially sanctioned. That's the difference.
Yes, I know, but are we still talking about just mass incompetence here?
I think the WhatsApp messages really revealed the actual reality of the situation. There wasn't a great cabal dealing with the great issues of the land, trying to manipulate society.
It's a great chaos.
It was just a lot of incompetent fools who are no more clever than you or I, who are dealing with one of the biggest issues of our lifetimes.
And very, very conscious of their own image and the trajectory of their own careers at the same time. No, we're all conscious of that. I'm not removing myself from that. My God, far from it. But you really do see the delicacy and the foibles of these people handling all of that.
How do you think this is going to, these WhatsApp messages, what kind of effect are they going to have on the official inquiry, which I believe has actually not quite started yet officially, but
I think they're going to have a profound effect, because one of the great fears, as with all of these commissions and inquiries, is that things get kicked into the long grass, and when you finally get the report out several years down the line, inevitably, or not inevitably, but often there's a whitewash, or at least issues are glossed over, and the real stuff, meaty stuff we were hoping would be addressed, isn't addressed. But what's happened with Oakeshot's leak is that so much media and public scrutiny has gone on to specific key important things, like the wearing of masks, like the rule of 6, like the lockdowns, that it's impossible now for the inquiry not to give them proper due attention and to report on those. So that's been an extremely important thing.
But even if the findings are really scathing, right? Remember what happened to Tony Blair with the inquiry about him and the Iraq War. He's fine, isn't he? Nothing will happen. Seriously, nothing will happen.
And on the sort of technical level, what's interesting is that WhatsApp messages up to this point and up to now aren't evidence that can be discovered, and you can't have discovery in a legal court.
Yes.
Now I think the case can be really made that these are virtual meetings. The WhatsApp group is a virtual meeting, and WhatsApp messages are actually equivalent to the minutes of a formal meeting. So whether you're in the cabinet office or the backseat of a car, a WhatsApp message will have the same status going forward, which should be a wake-up call for everybody who has WhatsApp, I think.
Do you know with these inquiries, I think how this can happen, I do not know. 85 million has already been spent on this. Already
85 million?
85 million.
Wow.
Already spent. And between about 1950 and up to 1980, 1990, something like that, there were 14 major public inquiries. In the past, I think 15 years, there have been 17. Now, to me, that means that you're having to have loads of inquiries because people keep screwing things up, essentially.
And we're just getting exponentially worse, and we'll need more and more.
But I would say
and
also,
more.
I think a lot of it is that there's a lot more media scrutiny. I often wonder how many of the politicians of the past actually would have had long careers had they not been
Where was the scrutiny over
openly exposed. Well, we're getting this now, I think, with the inquiries, right? That's my issue. I think there would have been many more inquiries if we had social media back
Tom
in
Dryburgh,
Well, look, it's going to happen, isn't it? So we'll presumably report, 5 years down the line or something? All these people will be yesterday's fish and chip paper, won't they? They'll all be gone.
Well, that's why I'm saying they'll get away with it,
Anyway.
essentially.
Well, look, thanks very much. Thanks very much, Ray, for that. That's it for Newspeak this week. Don't forget about our event in Manchester on the 28th. Please get in touch if you're interested and if you are local. That would be great. Thanks so much and see you soon. Bye. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.